I was exposed to that stereotype and kind of, here's what, you know, traditional kind of early settler experience, it needs to be functional type of artwork is what that Appalachian label is given. And I personally think it's whatever you want to label yourself is kind of truly who you are. And I know Jason, I wouldn't want to attach that label to him, but I am, I guess. I would consider him an Appalachian artist, one, because he's making work in Appalachia. He is an Appalachian. Right now, his, I think, immediate audience is mostly Appalachian folks. And the issues he's speaking to in his work. He's talking about his personal experience, his personal struggles, his triumph over those struggles, what he loves, what he wants to change, his community involvement, his activism. And all of that is, to me, integral to the Appalachian identity. And particularly for contemporary Appalachian artists, I think pushing that identity in any which direction you are is Appalachian. One, I'm honored to just be in the position to talk about Jason and his work, but I'm no means an expert of his work, and I'm sure there's masterpieces that I've yet to see in his, you know, vast portfolio. I was even trying to think about our first conversation officially, but if I recall, it was at one of those kind of art receptions, and he was kind of making the case that he wanted to be more involved in ETSU, and he kind of considered that there was two main art silos in Johnson City. Particularly, there was that academic side and the kind of the self-taught kind of do-it-yourself crowd. And he wanted to see, how can I bridge that? How can I enter into that, because I don't have a degree and I don't really want to get that degree. So I just mentioned one, I was like, well, I work at the Reese Museum. Maybe you could enter into the Fletcher exhibit and some of these other juried art shows, which he did. And he got in. So, and I think he's been in maybe 2 or 3 of those exhibitions with different jurors throughout the year. I know he got real involved with the local arts meetup that was Jocelyn Matthews has put together. And through that, we reached out right at the tail end of the pandemic. We asked Jocelyn to curate an exhibit, and it was called Contemporary Culture Makers. A number of local folks, but I believe Jason was part of that group. One, we loved his aesthetic, and beyond his aesthetic, I've just been really drawn to his energy as a person. And he's just so passionate about, you know, he's always telling himself, like, in the conversation, I need to calm down, I need to calm down. But we're like, no, we love it, go for it. But we invited him to be the guest artist for our inaugural hip hop, a history, or a cultural celebration of hip hop history. And so we thought we would tap into some of the visuals by giving him a hallway space while we hosted other events around the music and culture. So we got to see even more of his work there. And I got to interview him as part of a program during that, and we called it Between Two Flacks. And we had 2 Jason Flacks, and we just talked about his work, his influences, tied it into hip hop. And again, he kept talking about his passionate work, working in the community. But also, I've been able to support him just by going out to some other shows that had nothing to do with the Reese Museum. And then while we're there, someone, right at the most recent one, I think it was called A Touch of Gray in Morristown at the Rose Center, one of our frequent patrons here purchased an artwork for our collection from that show. And if I purchased a piece for my own collection from that show, our director bought a piece for her collection. So we're all just trying to grab up this amazing work that he is just, it seems like it's pouring out of him. And then I think it's like everyone else, like I keep, you know, just make sure you pay attention to those, you know, commission prices, you know, it's just like know your worth and all of that, which I know he does. But now that it's just like, oh, get your Jason Flack while you still can, or you can still afford it, because his reach is starting to, I think now he's creeping over state lines. Folks in Virginia are trying to collect up and things like that. Like conceptually and aesthetically, he has, you know, intense colors, bold lines, and the way he deals with lining up subject matter. Beyond color and line work, which to me is, you know, definitely him, but kind of how he presses it all together and kind of brings it into a frame. Some of his, I call them paint collages. They're all paint, all acrylic, but kind of collage of figures. He did something really interesting at this last hip hop exhibition here, and it was called The History of Hip Hop, a series of 4. And they actually were collaged elements of just faces kind of simply put up against a very blank, solid yellow, which I thought like, well, that's a choice, but it brought them all together. It put all of these artists on the same platform. They were all from different genres and different eras. So conceptually, he's kind of like, everyone's equal. We're all here. So visually, that's what I really get into. But even behind me, his mask, he loosened up on some of it to, get that hair flow, that more kind of figurative, expressive brush marks. And some of his newer work, I see more of that tightness, which I love both. But and I think kind of a marriage of both is kind of where I see his work kind of progressing towards. Without being biased, I love the works that we have here in our collection, part of the Samuel Nicely collection and also part of the Local Arts in the Age of the 2020 Global Pandemic collection. But one of my favorite works, it's a self-portrait. It's real simple. It was done pretty quick, and I think he did it in a sitting. And it's kind of melancholic, which is very ironic because if you know Jason, you're like, well, he's not a very melancholic kind of person. But in his write-up, he was talking about his experiences about getting involved in artwork and kind of getting back into that community after losing his twin sister and other aspects of his life that had changed, and then dealing with the pandemic. So I was so happy that got juried in. But one, I thought that was a really definitive kind of, not a turning point in his work, but I think it's a good kind of benchmark, because there I see things before that and things after. And then I just feel like he started coming into his own. He didn't change himself. He didn't change his work. He didn't change his work ethic. He just continued on, but he became vocal about it. And I think, he became comfortable with his work and talking about his work. And he found out that he has more allies than enemies. ETSU is a really supportive community. We're a service unit here at the Reese, and we try to bring that forward. So he had ideas and he was passionate, and we jumped on board. He's taken away a lot of excuses from people, and in a really good way. Just like, well, I would do that. And he's like, well, I did 20 of those and I'm doing this over here, and he's spread thin and he's still, taking care of his family and working. So it's just kind of like, well, why not? Stop complaining and make the work and do the work. So one, I think he's a role model in that way. And anyone who's kind of, and particularly too, for everyone involved, is the pandemic was kind of a catalyst. Everyone's lives changed. And, for me and talking to a lot of different artists and curators, people had two different routes. And it was, they kind of shut down, took a break, survived, didn't make anything. Or I know a lot of people who did the exact opposite. And I think Jason was probably the opposite. He kind of used that. He's like, oh no, I have time now. I can do this, I can be methodical. And I felt like he kind of exploded a little bit because he, pinned down and made work, where others just kind of, I think, dealt with whatever they were dealing with. I see him as more or less as a role model for not only folks who kind of built themselves up and learned it themselves, because I would consider him kind of that self-taught category, but also those who did it through academic means, who are professional artists or a curate. I call myself art adjacent. In many cases I'm kind of organizing or working or facilitating. But I'm learning just as much from him as, he might tell that, oh, I learned from you. But at this point, it's a symbiotic relationship. I feel very, very honored and privileged, one, to have known him at this part of his career, which I feel it's just the start.
I'm going to try not to cry. It's what a journey, what a life. How do I follow that? Man, I might tear up. So forgive me. And I can put everyone here into verbal submission. We'll be here until 11 if we're not careful. I didn't write anything. Just want to make this from the heart. Yeah, I have to thank God, and I'll give you a story. I didn't have much else to do but art, and then I realized it was a necessary therapy for me. Let's go back to 2010. just a little over 13 years ago, I was 23 years old, and at best I was couch surfing, and at worst I was living in my Nissan Sentra. I'm 6'2", a Nissan Sentra is about 6'5", so I was living pretty good. I got a call one day, and I was just working, not because of the love for work, but I was working out of town. There's a beautiful lady here named Sheila. She's my mother. I kept all of that away from her. I didn't have the heart to tell my mother how I was living. It's not because I didn't have great parents. I did. I just didn't want to be a baby bird. I couldn't go backwards. So I lived in a car, went out of town to work, and she called me, and I rolled my eyes because I thought, now I've got to explain to my mother how I'm living, how her son is treating himself. But she had confidence in her voice, and she said, "Jason, I found a house. It's a lot like you. It needs work." The very next day, as soon as I could, I signed a one-year lease. It was a family that I would get to know and love, and I would find out the person that owned that house was a mover and a shaker. She would look me up and down. She would look at my piercings. She would look at my skin. She'd look at my tattoos, and she just couldn't figure me out. Then she would see me in the paper. Now I was a mover and a shaker, and she gained respect. And I thought that was a merit. That was sort of my a badge of honor. I was her deputy. I didn't just live there for 1 year. I ended up living there for 10. And all I did was paint. All I did was create in the name of art's sake. I dedicate this to my twin sister, Jessica, who is not here to see this anymore. I dedicate this also to a movement that I speak of constantly when they called me crazy, which is probably a little true. But also, I want to leave something here. And it's very simple. And again, I'm trying to make sure that I'm kind of tempering my conversation here with you because I'll be here all night. Trust me. I'm leaning in everything. Plus, I had a beer. My grandfather commanded and demanded respect. My mom would nod her head. We know now that he was dying when he said this, but it's one of the last things he told me. And I haven't said this out loud in front of so many people. There's so many people gone. What a life. I mean, I have to follow this. What a life. What a life. He finally could see I was doing something with myself. I was never a knucklehead, but I just couldn't figure it out. And he could see Jason's doing something, and he was dying. And he said, "Jason," and he had sharp, sharp blue eyes. He was a squad leader in the military. He said, "Jason, do it while you can, son." And just like I wish I could tell him, I'll tell you I haven't stopped since. Thank you. Thank you.